Hello, welcome to another live screencast. And this is lung functional anatomy, part one. We'll look at part two then as sort of the microscopic level in another lecture here. So identify, describe, and explain the general location of the lungs, identify some of the major lobes of the lungs, describe and explain the basic structure and function of what is meant by respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, as well as alveoli, and then describe and explain the structure and function of the serous membranes on the surface of the lungs. Okay, so the location of the lungs, as you already sort of know, is that the lungs are lateral to the heart and they are superior to the diaphragm, and they fill most of the thoracic cavity. This is always sometimes a little surprising to students looking at this for the first time. So when you look at the mannequins, take out all of the lungs and just see like how much of that thoracic cavity is actually lung. It actually goes, if you look at this image here through the transverse section, you're used to seeing, just on the mannequins, you see sort of this anterior portion here. But when you remove the entire lung, you'll see that it actually how large that lung actually is, and that it fills up the most of that thoracic cavity. So these lungs are very sensitive tissues, and they are protected by the ribs laterally and posteriorly and anteriorly. They are protected by the sternum, and then also by costal cartilages here. So look at I would encourage you to look at the skeletons as well. So here is the sternum. The costal cartilages are lateral to that, and then you have the ribs here as well. Between the ribs, you're going to have intercostal muscles, which are also protective. So this is lateral and posterior and anterior, and then inferiorly, here's the diaphragm. So on the mannequins, look at that diaphragm and see how that actually physically is going to separate that thoracic cavity. Here's the diaphragm again, that thoracic cavity from that abdominal cavity. Right? So here they're showing you just sort of the location of the heart, and they've sort of pulled back, resected some of the lungs here. And so let's go look at the lungs and sort of what they are. So gross structure here is that each lung is divided into lobes, right, by fissures. The left lung has 2 lobes, and the right lung has 3 lobes. That left lung only has 2 lobes. They're a little bit larger because, again, that heart right here is sort of off center a little bit, right? And so as the heart is growing and developing, that makes this left lung a little bit smaller than the right lung. So if we look at that right lung, there are 3 main lobes that I want you to be responsible for, and they are named accordingly. And this naming actually sort of makes sense, right? So you have an upper lobe, you have a middle lobe, and then a lower lobe. And so here's an image from another textbook down here that's colored. So you have this superior lobe or upper lobe, inferior lobe or lower lobe, and then here's the middle lobe. And each of those lobes is then subdivided into smaller, sublobes, right? Anterior, apical, posterior, etc. I'm not sure that you need to be familiar with all the names of all those, but understanding the fact that the lobe is divided into the lung is divided into lobes, and that provides an area for expansion, right? It actually enables that lung to expand, and as the thoracic cage expands, right? And this is going to draw air in, which we'll deal with when we talk about respiratory physiology, right? So in the center of this diagram here, we just see again, here's the trachea branching into the 2 main bronchi, and then secondary bronchi in red, and then tertiary bronchi. So each of these secondary bronchi and tertiary bronchi are serving each of the individual lobes, right? So air is moving toward, right, and also away from the air spaces there, right? So when we go to look at this at a little bit more of the microscopic level, we see that we had, again, the bronchioles. These are the primary bronchi, and then secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi. And then we get down into this structure right here. And this is at the microscopic level. And this is what most of the lung is. Most of the lung is not really tissue. It's mostly airspace. Right? And so you have these respiratory units down here that are, there are millions of them. And so if we have this terminal bronchiole right here, this is even past the tertiary bronchi part. So these bronchioles are small little ones, and there's no cartilage here supporting these things. But these terminal bronchioles then branch and end up in these respiratory bronchioles. So it goes terminal bronchiole to respiratory bronchiole. And then each of those respiratory bronchioles is going to then branch into an alveolar duct. This alveolar duct then leads down into an alveolus. Right? An alveolus, right, or alveoli is the plural, right, looks like a bunch of grapes, right, where each of the grapes would be actually a hollow air sac, right, and it's a dead end. Right? So, or like a cul-de-sac, right? So this would be a pipe stem, and you drive into the cul-de-sac, et cetera. So those of you that live in cul-de-sacs, you can sort of visualize that way. So these alveolar ducts here and the respiratory ducts and these alveoli are going to have capillaries all on the outside surface, and we'll look at that at another screencast. But what's happening is that these alveolar ducts here lead to these alveoli, and this spherical shape of the alveolus provides maximum surface area to volume ratio. This maximum surface area to volume ratio is so that you can get the maximum and most efficient gas exchange happening, right? And that is CO2 and O2, right? You're dumping off CO2 and picking up oxygen there. So again, this pathway, these are at the microscopic level. There's no way you'd be able to see these on a mannequin or anything, but you'd want to look at it under a microscope slide, which I think that we have some slides back there, right? So that's the lung. That's like sort of the inside of the lung. On the outside surface of the lung, there are serous membranes that protect and aid in the functioning of the lungs. Right? So what I want to call your attention to again first is that these serous membranes are epithelial in nature. They are not open to the outside world. And there are going to be two of them, right? There is a visceral pleura and there is a parietal pleura. So these serous membranes of the lungs are referred to as pleura, right? Or a pleural membrane. Right? Now, don't confuse that with plural like there's more than one, right? So here's the spelling here. Right, so the visceral pleura is on the surface of the lung tissue itself, and then the parietal pleura is along the inner wall of the thorax or the rib cage. Right? Now between them, if you zoom in and look at this right here, again, pardon me, here is the visceral pleura. This is the one that's on the surface. Here's the parietal pleura. This is the one that is going to be in contact with the rib cage and the intercostal muscles, as you see here, but then there is a space between them, and so this pleural cavity, right, has pleural fluid in it. Right? That fluid helps to keep the pleura connected to one another. And so this pleural fluid here, it's not much, it's a couple milliliters worth total, is enough to keeps the lung from collapsing in on itself. And in class we'll do some demonstrations here about how that actually works, right? But you need to be able to identify the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura in a diagram this way, as well as one this way, showing it in cross-section, right? And so again, here we have a cross-section through the thorax, a little bit above the heart level here. So here would be the heart, right? And this would be the aorta, and here's the aortic semilunar valve, and here's the pulmonary trunk, right? And then the right and left pulmonary arteries. Here you see the two main bronchi, right? So we've cut there below, pardon me, where the trachea is. Right? And so now when you look at the mannequins here and you look at the lungs, you should be able to then identify, okay, there are pulmonary arteries, here are pulmonary veins, and then these are the primary, secondary bronchi, et cetera. Right? On the surface of that lung then, here you see a fissure, right, that's dividing that into lobes. Right? On the surface, in red here, is the visceral pleura, here's the parietal pleura, and then there would be pleural fluid in between there. Notice that this visceral pleura here becomes continuous with this membrane that's the outer one of the heart, and if you're good, you'll remember what that membrane is called, and then there's a membrane that's on the surface of the heart as well, right? Not the pleural membranes, though. Right? So there is a little bit about the lung. We'll look at the detail of that respiratory unit in another screencast here. So you should be able to identify the location of the lungs, where the lobes are, basic structure and function, and that bell is annoying. Basic structure and function of respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts as well as the alveoli, and identify and describe those serous membranes and their purpose, structure, and function. Thanks for listening and being here. Cancel? What? No, keep that. I don't know why this is happening.